think I can
Okay,
go
let me know
live
when
now.
you're live.
Well, I will be in a second, probably. All right, I believe we are live now.
Okay. Hi,
Awesome,
how you doing?
pretty good. How is everybody doing who has come to our stream? Sorry, this was a rather late announcement. That was entirely my fault. I completely flubbed it this morning. But thankfully, there seem to be people here anyway. So we have actually a new version of the ephemeral system to show. But before we do that, I guess I will answer some questions because it looks like Chris Smith has some. Chris Smith asks, do you plan to have a public beta of the ephemeral system before release? That is actually kind of a good question. Um,
I don't think we've considered it. It's still a little ways off.
yeah,
We'll definitely have some kind of a beta.
sure.
We'll probably start off actually with an alpha where we ask some people we know to test it out.
Right, that'll
As
be the
for a
first
public
thing.
beta, I don't know that we've considered that yet.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I mean, certainly there will be some kind of demo version or something to play with, like regardless of like when that happens. Maybe that will be some kind of thing where there'll be like a beta version that does, but we don't really have a specific plan, so I can't really say, I guess. Chris Smith also asked, do the ephemeral and outline tools take advantage of the GPU? I'm not quite sure what you mean by outline. Contour, perhaps? Uh,
Maybe the onion skinner.
maybe the onion skinner, right? So the onion skinner is not ours, actually. I mean, that's a system that tool written by Christoph Lendenfeld that I've been using, and it is I mean, in a sense, it does use the GPU because it's using VP2, which of course is rendering all this stuff on the GPU. So I suppose in that case you would say yes, but it's not a performance critical thing anyway because it's just saving these images and displaying them. Um, in terms of the ephemeral system, I would actually say that for the ephemeral system itself, there is no reason why it should use the GPU. So deformers probably really ought to, right? GPUs are amazing, right? That's the whole reason why we have GPUs. They're astonishingly, amazingly good at doing enormous amounts of parallel math, right? And for a deformer, that's perfect. And like a lot of deformation doesn't always happen on the GPU, and right now Contour is it's heavily parallelized, but it's happening on the CPU. But in an ideal world, I think all deformation would just like the whole deformation stack would be on the GPU, right? Now for for something like the ephemeral system, it's totally different, right? I don't see any benefit to putting the ephemeral system on the GPU because the ephemeral system, like the actual behavior of the system itself, is not going to be a performance bottleneck if it's written in a performant language. Right now, it's like kind of okay. I mean, here this gives you a sense of how inherently fast the ephemeral system is. The current one version that we've written is written in Python. Now it is compiled with something called Nuitka, which does seem to give it some a speed boost over just regular Python. And that's basically what that does is it takes Python, compiles it to C, and then compiles the C code to an actual executable. Well, it's not an executable. I mean, in this case, we're using it as a PYD file, so that's not quite the same thing as an executable, but it is
It's a
actual machine
binary
code.
though.
It's a binary, right?
It's a binary. But I mean, the thing about it is that the performance issues with Contour, I mean, not Contour, with the ephemeral system, to a large degree, just kind of come from Maya and
That's
querying the
right.
Maya scenes. And
Exactly.
so it's not even the Python.
It's not even right.
The bits of math that the ephemeral system's doing, if you were to write it in C, for instance, I have a cat attempting to climb all over
Yeah, I could
like
hear the
my
purrs.
microphone.
Like,
Yeah. So sorry about that. You're getting some free kitty purring and some microphone noise out of that. But yeah, what was I saying? Yeah, if you rewrote that in C, or we've actually talked a little bit about rewriting. So a lot of the sort of scaffolding of the ephemeral system really has to be in Python in order to interact with Maya.
right.
But for a lot of the work, we have sort of a separation between the Maya interaction stuff and the system that calculates it. We've talked about rewriting it in something else, and possibly Clojure, actually. We've been doing some Clojure in terms of other stuff, and because of some stuff that's come along, like GraalVM. I don't even know how you pronounce that, GraalVM. It's possible to compile to like binaries and DLLs too that could be called into from Python. So we might do that. And that's the thing. Clojure is not a high performance language. in the same way that C is, right? But it's plenty fast enough.
Right.
Python has some performance issues doing certain types of things. If you create a lot of garbage in Python using the standard Python implementation, it can slow things down a bit.
Right.
But yeah.
Yeah.
Anyway,
I mean, the point I was making was that even though, Enuica makes it a little bit faster, it's still much slower than if you wrote it in a performant language from the get-go, right? But even so, even though we did it in this way that was not really very performant, like, the performance issues with the ephemeral system don't come from the actual computation in the ephemeral system at all, right? Because the thing about it is that it's actually very simple in terms of the actual math it needs to do. We're not talking about thousands of vertices. We're talking about dozens of matrices. And so the speed, certainly it could be faster than it is, but putting it on the GPU wouldn't really gain you anything. The GPU is great for situations in which you just have things that are just massively parallel, like deformers, right? Or image processing in most cases, right? Or
yeah.
like rendering a scene in a game engine, right? Like all of these cases where you can just like, yeah. Speaking of, please stop bugging me about that. Thank you.
We're both being catted, huh?
No. I was actually talking about the fact that the Xbox app decided to, which I probably should just uninstall, decided to pop up a pop-up on my screen.
That might have been Jinx.
No. I have her locked out of the office right now. She is not going to get to mess around with me at the moment.
I do not have my cat locked out, partially because I can't really because of the other cats. They don't necessarily always get along well, and if I'm not around to pay some attention, it's kind of better that they're not together. But yeah, I mean, I would say this. It's possible that there will be some features in the future that require more computation in the ephemeral system. There are some things I can think of, but I still think that, write it in highly optimized C and it's probably going to be fast enough.
Oh, yes. No, I mean, I would go so far as to say, as because of the way the ephemeral system works and because of how little computation is actually involved compared to like your actual deformation of a mesh, I don't see that we'd even gain anything by parallelizing it on the CPU. Like, write the parts that need to be performant of it in C, and it will be so fast that it's just not going to matter. And so all of the cases where it would make sense to do stuff on the GPU are more like were contour, right? Stuff that deforms a mesh. That's a whole different story.
Unfortunately, there are some issues with the way that Contour works in terms of the scene graph and the way that Maya does GPU deformation that make it quite tricky to get Contour onto the GPU. And it's something that, like, in principle, Contour could be done on the GPU really well. Contour would, it's, they talk about certain problems as being embarrassingly parallel, certain algorithms, and the Contour algorithm is embarrassingly parallel. It like can butt up against the theoretical limits of parallelism, but it's hard to do in Maya. It might be possible. We need to look into it further, but it's not straightforward because of the way we have to structure the scene graph to avoid doing redundant computation, right?
Indeed. So, now, that's worth noting, however, that despite not being on the GPU, Contour actually plays very well with Maya's GPU override. It's just that it doesn't take part in it. But any deformers you stack on top of it can effectively...
And Contour is also super heavily optimized C code.
Yes.
Like we really went through Contour with a fine-tooth comb, and it could probably be made faster in some ways. I mean, you're never quite done optimizing, but like it's pretty optimized.
Well, the really nice thing about it is that I have found Contour to be Contour rigs, even though like so Contour itself, like its algorithm is much more it requires much more computation than linear blend skinning. Nevertheless, I have found most Contour rigs to be significantly faster than their equivalent conventional rigs, not because the algorithm is faster, but because so much extra stuff doesn't need to be done. Right? Contour is handling an enormous amount of stuff you normally have to handle through the node graph in a way that is very heavily well parallelized, in a way that is very performant. And in the end, in my experience, in most cases, like Contour actually ends up being faster.
There's a fair bit of overhead to the rigging you'd have to do to get the stuff that Contour gives you, and that overhead through the Maya scene graph is sort of greater. And it's a little surprising that that's the case, but it is true, which is surprising because Contour is actually, there's a lot of math in Contour, an awful lot of math. It's doing a tremendous amount of vector calculation, and it really would be nice to get it on the GPU.
Yeah.
if we were to implement it on a different platform, if we were, for instance, to put Contour into Unreal, we would do that. And I do think you could probably get quite a number of characters deforming with Contour if you had a good GPU.
Oh,
You know,
absolutely.
the
Like
question
it's
is, how much would game developers be willing to give up in terms of particle effects and stuff? I mean, they're jealous of every cycle, right? Would they be
right.
willing to give cycles up for better deformation?
Well, so
Hard to say.
what I think is true actually, and this is kind of the direction I think things will go in the long run, is that you'll get, and like we've said this many times, we would love to put Contour into Unreal, right? We'll get
Possibly
people,
Unity too. Possibly
yeah.
Unity too.
I
Right.
mean, you would use the deformation directly for linear production, where it would still, I mean, look, if we put Contour on the GPU, it's going to be quite fast. It's not going to perhaps be fast enough to have 100 enemy fighters, whatever, on screen, who knows, right? But it's going to be plenty fast for a lot of, like non-game applications, for a lot of
Well,
linear production
they also have
applications.
this new machine learning stuff.
Right, that's
in
what I was
Unreal,
getting to.
and I imagine it's going to come to other engines as well. This kind of machine learning deformer. I mean, that's not to say though that there might not be real advantages of the actual Contour algorithm over the machine learning stuff. I think you'd have to see what the deal is. We don't know yet. We haven't played with it.
Oh, there absolutely would be, I expect. However, my point basically is that with the direction I think I see this going is that more advanced deformation will be used right in engine for linear production purposes and get baked through ML for like in-game purposes, or perhaps
might be the case.
Or perhaps you'd even use it, the full full deformation for cinematics or something, like even within the same project.
Like in-game cinematics is a pretty good use case. Anyway, we should probably move on with our lives.
Yep. Sorry, let me get to. We talked a lot about that. So let me go to Chris Smith's next comment. You talked about a very interesting theory of the face rig you use. At some point, you're going to show us how to put that theory into practice. Yeah,
I think he may be talking about the Ghost Rig.
He might be talking about the Ghost Rig. He might also be talking about the stuff that we were talking about using, and I sort of showed this a little bit with when we were looking at the Little Bird rig, is that he could be referring to the essentially like retopo your mesh so that you end up with like more or less an edge loop per control or something like that. That view of things that sort of sidesteps a lot of the actual work of doing a face rig. Either one of those things, yeah, we should absolutely get to that. Like here's the thing. Like I think converting the old Ghost face file is probably going to be a lot of work at this point, but I could also create something very much like it, right now. And it absolutely is something we should do, because there was a lot of interesting stuff in that facial rig. And I think a lot of what actually that displays, a big part of that was actually the use of the constraints, because one of the things that Contour just does really, really well, and I use this constantly, is we've certainly seen it on previous streams as well, is using the constraints to drive controls. And in that case, you're using the constraints to drive to drive splines, to drive other contour chains that being driven by your main contour chain. So you've got this head and you want to be able to just like bend it in whatever direction. You can have other contour chains or static influences, like all kinds of things, and drive them off your main spline, so that the same thing that's deforming your mesh is also pushing the controls that'll move your mesh around. And that's a really, really powerful technique. We used it a little bit in a previous stream, looking at the Pirate and looking at putting secondary controls all over his surface. And this is a technique that's pretty similar, but used essentially for a different purpose. So there, yeah, we should absolutely go into that. That should be fodder for a future stream for sure.
But we should probably get onto the meat of this stream.
Let's get on to the meat of this stream. So, I'm actually going to try something. Unfortunately, I'm in a room that gets quite hot if I don't turn on the air conditioning. So I am going to do so and hope that it doesn't add lots and lots of noise to the audio here. Give me a second, and you can tell me, Tagore, how bad this actually gets.
Okay, I'm going to have to switch my audio in that case, because I'm listening to you over Discord, not YouTube. So Let me see if I can figure out how to mute you here.
I mean, also, any of the viewers, like, please pipe up if it's actually hard to hear me because there's too much background noise. Like, that's the main thing, right? I mean, I don't really mind if there's a little noise in the background if you can still hear me clearly. But if you can't, that's kind of a problem. And it is indeed different between YouTube and Discord.
I can still hear you. There is some noise in the background. I can hear the AC.
Okay, Adam W. Parker says sound is okay. So I'm going to say, I don't really mind if there's a little noise as long as you can still hear me. So,
Yeah, no, you're very audible. That's fine.
yeah. So anyway, let's get to it. So there is what I am showing you here is actually a new version of the ephemeral system that we've sort of been working on for a while now, actually, but had not displayed publicly because various bits of it were still being worked on, and it's a significant refactoring of the system. The behavior is pretty much the same as you've seen. However, the internals work very differently, and that's allowed us now to start adding some new features. For instance, color coding. So I don't really think that the way that this color coding is implemented right now is necessarily what we'll end up going with. But it is interesting to talk about, in part because I think it makes a lot more clear what's actually going on in the graph. So what's happening here is every time the ephemeral system rebuilds the graph, because it's got its own internal graph that is its own thing that we wrote that isn't part of the Maya graph, sort of as I've described, is that hey, look, we didn't. That's right. I was about to say, this is a bug. It shouldn't be highlighting the hand, but actually it should because of the glue group. So this is it doing exactly what it should. But basically what I have it doing now is whenever it builds the graph, it also color codes these controls based on what constraint is being used. And I don't actually think that's as helpful as it could be. And I also think that simply color coding the controls is not enough to really tell you what the graph is doing. We're going to need some kind of indicator to be like, okay, this control is being driven in this particular way, but by what? Right? That's a pretty critical bit of information that's currently kind of missing. But what this does do is let you see things like, okay, so I've selected like his spine 1 control, right? And this is in default mode, meaning I can move it around like this. Here, let me actually, in order to, I'm going to go and make like a new pose so I don't screw up any existing poses. Although, it should be noted, undo should actually work better now than it used to. It used to be that doing multiple undos with the ephemeral system was a dodgy thing to do. That shouldn't be true anymore. Given the work that we've put into sort of the back end of everything. But we'll see. I don't necessarily promise it's not going to do something bad. We'll find out. Anyway, the deal here is, right, so now I'm moving it around in default mode where I'm translating things, and you can see the things that don't move. Things that don't move are gray. Things that are constrained with a point constraint are orange, and things that are suspended are green. Which I'm not sure if I like that color coding, actually, because green is maybe too similar to the selection green. But basically the idea here is, if I were to switch to forward mode, for instance, you can then see that these are all parent constrained, because they are now being controlled, in a, by this control. But, for instance, because we still have isolate rotation on, the shoulders are point constrained. If I were to turn off isolate rotation, the shoulders and the head become blue because they are now parent constrained and will now move in a completely classic FK way. And I'll switch it back again to sort of show you the difference. Now they're orange, and these, you can't really see the, here, let me switch to forward all so that everything above the waist is FK, and you can see that, among other things, it's moving the cube around as it should because they are being paired together. But as you can see, the controls here are being isolated in rotation, meaning they have a point constraint. So I do want to note something about the ephemeral concept of constraints. First of all, just to note that they are utterly and completely unlike the Maya constraints. They're a totally different thing, and you don't ever tell a control to have any particular constraint. You tell it what behavior it ought to do, and the constraint gets created by the system according to that behavior. That is one of the reasons why I actually think that what I have here is probably really not the right thing, because it's the information it's telling you is what constraint is applied, which isn't actually what you decide. You decide what behavior is applied. So I think that this is probably not the right way to display this information, and sort of I need to put some more thought into that. Probably it would be better to have color coding along forward or backward behavior, say. But basically, this does at least give you a sense of what is it that's actually happening here. If I switch to backward all, for instance, I'm going to turn off isolate rotation again. You can see that now, the hands are not being, they are gray, meaning they are not doing anything. They're unconstrained. The elbows are green, meaning that they are suspended. Our pseudo IK. The everything that is backwards of the of the upper body is blue because it is all being parent constrained. And some things that are isolated, that are still isolated because they're simply attached with translation in this scenario rather than being parent constrained, are actually point constrained. So it gives you a bunch more insight into what the ephemeral system is actually doing. So for instance, like I'm going to switch over to backwards mode and rotate from here, and it should be pretty obvious what mode you're in by this color coding, even if the color coding is not really quite the right thing. It doesn't give you all the information I'd like to give you. In addition to which, I kind of feel like color coding itself is probably insufficient, right? What you probably need here are some lines and stuff, like connecting this stuff so you can see this information about not only how is my control being driven, but what is it being driven by. And so that's all stuff that we'll continue to iterate on. But for the moment, I think this will be pretty useful, and I should probably start animating some stuff. Hopefully, given that this is a new version that has never actually been used to animate anything before, it won't explode. I hope that it doesn't explode. I guess we'll find out. Anyway, so let's...
You have an older version, like, handy to switch
Oh,
to
yes,
if
I
you have
do.
to, right?
Yes, I do.
Okay.
Okay. I didn't do the dumb thing. I absolutely can
That's
switch
good.
back to the version we were using last week, as needed. But I'm hoping it won't be needed. I'm hoping this will all work properly. All right, let's watch through this. It's actually been 2 weeks since I watched this, so let's see if I have any new insights into this motion that I did not previously have. Yeah, I mean, there's definitely things that I'm going to refine as I go through, and I should probably just start doing that because let's hopefully get somewhere with this one. Take a little less time. I got to start my onion skinning. Take a little less time than we did in the previous versions, previous streams. You can see how much difficulty I'm having talking right now, apparently, where we were doing a whole lot of ranting and talking and a lot less actually getting animation done. So... yeah, so let's, now that we've got onion skinning up, let's take a look at this and say, as we often do, what's the next question to answer? Like, what don't we know about this motion that we need to know next? And I'm going to say it's still the spin around. Like, that's certainly the more complicated part of the shot. So let's start filling that out some more. All right, so he's up there. We're gonna have the idea, right? Like, how does he get to there, for instance? Like, that's something that we need to answer, so let's answer it. I'm going to say that I'm going to do this breakdown in forward mode. Yeah. What just happened? Well, I was afraid of this. I did test, like, doing breakdowns and stuff, but apparently some scenario here is clearly not working in this new version, and I'm gonna go restart Maya and switch to the old version. I always knew this could happen. At least I got a chance to show you what the color coding is maybe gonna be like, and we're just gonna go back to doing it the old way because apparently, I really kind of expected that to happen, honestly.
Yeah, I have a very strong suspicion you're passing none into into a function that
pretty
requires
sure
an
I
integer.
am.
That's
I'm
what it
pretty
looks
sure
like.
I am. And the test didn't catch it, which is unfortunate. But yeah, it is because I didn't write any for the color coding yet, so that's one thing. Actually, I should call this one new. This is my ridiculous way of like switching which version I'm using. Which is the sort of thing one does much more often than one would hope. Oh, sorry. 2018 is not the version of Maya we're using for this. Can never keep track because so many projects, standardize on different versions. All right. Yep. I'm gonna let Maya actually load itself, which always takes longer than you think it's going to. This should be the old version that actually does work. With the old colors that were not created by the ephemeral system, but I simply, set these up when I set up the character. All right. Getting my onion skinning back. All right, we should be good to go now. Yeah, there we go. Let me make that a little brighter. Okay, let's get back to where we were. All right, we want to be in forward mode. We want rotation isolation to be off. Let's do a breakdown. Okay. So, the idea here is he's actively falling, right? Like he can't control this thing, and it's causing him to like practically fall over. So he's gotta get his. Let's see. He's gonna end up doing that. So here's what I'm going to do first. I'm gonna go take this foot and put it back where it was. Actually, there's that. Not where it was. Oh, I'm in forward mode. See, here's where having the color coding would have been really useful. There we go. I mean, obviously that's not exactly what it'll look like, but I just want to get it back into the position it'll be so I can figure out what I do want to do with it, which is maybe, like, have it start coming off the floor at this point. Let's see. What I'm actually thinking of doing is actually putting it up here a little bit, because think about the arc of this cube, right? Like, the way I was thinking about it at one time, but I ended up deciding that this wasn't the right thing, is that the cube was going to fully lead his motion. But that didn't lead to motion that was as interesting as I wanted it to be. So instead, his body kind of is. And the question is, what moves first? Like, what leads that? Well, maybe push that over to where it's going to be. Put it up like this, because he's... Oh, not the pelvis. There we go. Ah, you know what this now suggests? So, we're getting back to, no pose is actually sacrosanct. Once you start seeing how it all comes together, you just keep refining them. This ought to go further, I think, in this pose that was already there. Yeah, okay, and so now this is going to end up changing a little bit, but let's get there to do a second. And I'm going to do something a little different with this leg too, and have it actually start coming over a little earlier. Because I think that'll flow together a little bit more nicely. Right. So, the idea that he has to... He's, that's got to go way faster. See, that motion might actually happen in like 2 frames. Which is going to suggest actually that I'm going to want to push the pelvis... Sorry, not the pelvis, the torso. The shoulder, whatever you want to call it, right? A little bit back towards its previous position. I do really, really love just using the sliders. Like, bias is such a useful thing. And then we're going to need to actually put a little more work into figuring out how is this going to function, right? How is this going to function right here? because I am thinking that I need to exaggerate his body position way more there. I mean, keeping in mind that we are doing here completely insane cartoony stuff, right? Like, this is not really how this would work. Like, this isn't really a thing like you can do with your body, but it fits my conception of how this is working. He's got this foot down here, and in fact, it ought to be moving back a little bit at this point already. He's pushing off with that foot and trying to, while he's trying to control, to counterbalance, like this gigantic weight just swinging around that he can barely control. So he's got to be pushing his pelvis way faster than his torso. I keep saying torso. You know, it's weird. It's a weird thing because it's kind of not his torso, right? It's his shoulders or whatever. But I have often used the term torso in a somewhat questionable manner in my time as an animator and rigger. All right, so he's like, all right. So I am now just sort of like scrubbing through, and I'm trying to firm up how I feel the body mechanics in this part is flowing. Not only that, but we can cartoonify this even a bit more. Like, let's not be afraid to make this stuff really toony. And flow that, the shape, you know, the whole arc the foot's going to take. With his motions. So now, what do we do here? Because I feel like this now has to work a little differently than I had it as. I'm going to return to that hand again in a moment, but basically, let's see. Yeah, got to trail it a little more. Or here, I'll just use bias again. Not that far, of course. Being able to do bias and being able to do it in the context of whatever rig mode you're in and with any set of controls you're in, like, is really awesome. This is one of the things that makes this so much faster. Turning off. I'm just going to cheat that arm. Who cares? Let's see. Again, I'm going to cheat the hell out of it. Doesn't matter. I'm going to come back to that arm probably. Yeah, it'll probably end up being a little different. But I do feel now like we are getting somewhere in terms of the flow of that motion. At least in screen space. It looks ridiculous from the other view, but who cares? This isn't a game. If it was a game, it would matter. It's not a game. And because of that, now I want to push this arm in a different direction and have a different sort of curve to it. Yeah, I didn't set that up properly. I'm using the Pickwalker tool that I wrote and that I really want to put up on GitHub at some point soon. I need to fix some issues with it first. Oh, whoops. Turned off. There we go. Don't want that to be turned off. Alright, let's just sort of look through this. Let's see. Well, I think that answers some of the questions about like how his body should handle this. But certainly not all of them. For one thing, I think I can make this. I think this is actually a little too fast. The last time when I was playing around with it, I made it super fast because I wanted this sense of like slow, slow, slow. Whoosh. But I think I went a little too far. Let's see if that's actually true. It might not be. I'm gonna make some of this stuff. Let's see. I'm gonna actually extend the shot a little bit. Is what I'm gonna do. You do still, I think, want this sense of speed to that motion. The idea that you're doing this big thing where he's losing his balance, and then he like has to do this very drastic motion. You do want that to be pretty fast, but pretty fast. I think this was maybe a little too much. Yeah, that does feel a little better to me. And one of the things I really want to focus on too is what this arm is doing here, because that is, I think, an opportunity for adding something interesting to the motion that isn't really quite evident yet, and I need to exaggerate it a little more. So like this hand here, it's like coming up and around, and that like catch is actually kind of like an interesting aspect to his motion that I want to maintain. So we'll get to that in a second. And by a second, I mean like a couple of minutes probably, but you know, probably not too long from now. Okay, so let's fill this out a little bit more. I think that the next question to answer is actually a bit of what's going on in here, because we kind of can see what's happening here easily enough, but how is it going to lead into that motion? We'll do this one in default, but use blend all nodes. I'm going to do a breakdown that's kind of like this. Well, that was not the control I thought it was. Let's actually exaggerate this a little bit more. We really can go even more cartoony with this. And just to point out, since this is a notional pipe stream, of course, this is exactly the sort of thing that would be incredibly painful to set up in a normal rig, and you'd have to explicitly do it. This is contour, the deformation, so stuff like that just sort of comes naturally, and as long as you have the ability to move your joints around, in this case they're being controlled by the ephemeral controls, but like whatever control system you have, same deal basically, you're going to get good results. Which is definitely not true. Alright, let's look at that arc. Because, let's move this up a little bit. So here's where thinking about arcs matters tremendously. Alright, let's actually move this up a little bit, I think. Let's see, because it's like this. He's sort of falling over. Let's make sure to get the arc. Yeah, see that like tip? I like that aspect of it. Honestly, the biggest problem with getting this swoop to look nice is that the corner is going to cut right through the ground. Maybe I don't even care. Maybe I don't even care. All right. All right, we're getting a little bit more of that sense of like being off balance now. Alright, let's then move on. So I feel like, that's one question answered. What's the next question? Well, I think it is going to be this area in here, and that question of, like, how does he grab onto it with his hand? Because that's like, an area of the shot that needs... Where there's just an opportunity to do something more interesting that isn't really happening yet. And so defining exactly what that is probably the next bit to worry about. Right, like what is his hand gonna do? I am thinking that having it be, you see where it sort of comes up with the thing and then grabs on sort of from this direction, so the arc is up and around. I don't know if that's clear enough. So here, this is sort of a question of staging, right? We want to make sure that the part of the shot that is interesting is most evident to the audience's eye. And what's going on right now is, if you sort of look at his motion as a whole, I feel like that catch is being lost in the overall motion of his body and sort of like centering the weight again. So would it make more sense to have, well, actually, I think I maybe see how this ought to work. Yeah, maybe it's also, I mean, it may be both a staging and timing problem, right? Well, I mean, they're sort of connected. Like, those aren't really separable concepts, but, you know, like, his hand is on the thing at this point, but should he actually finish the catch right here before he pulls it in instead of having it happen at the same time? Yeah, I think he should, actually. I think that's part of why the catch doesn't really, like, show up very well. And here's where, once I get to implementing selfish nodes, we'll have a really nice way of dealing with this problem. So the problem that we have right now is that if I were to turn off blends use all nodes, and I were to take the, I mean, I'll just show it to you. I'll save first in case undo doesn't work for some reason. The new version, really, I swear, if it wasn't, undo actually works all the time in the new version. Probably, hopefully. But anyway, what you'd want to be able to do is to say, oh, I want to preserve where this hand is relative to the box. So you'd want to be like, well, you know, if I'm in forward mode, so like this should be controlled by, well, I mean, actually, it doesn't really matter what mode you're in, as the thing is in a glue group, right? So it's being, well, you would want it to be in a mode that does not imply that it's controlled by something else. So actually, forward would be completely wrong, because that's going to mean that it's controlled by the elbow, which, again, you know, this will be more clear if we have the color coding. The default would be this is free, and therefore it's free to be controlled by the glue group. However, what you'd ideally want is to be able to say, oh, well, when I bias, I'm getting this thing's relative to its parent, which in this case would be the box, and I'm pushing it back to the relationship that it has to the box on this other frame. That's not going to work right now. Here's what's going to happen instead. Yeah, what happens instead... Come on, undo. Do your thing. No! Damn it! Should have known. Well, that's why I just saved. It's all fixed in the new version if the new version was working. Here, let me just do something real quick. You gotta reestablish the onion skins every time you reload because of, you know, a reason that I probably don't want to explain right now. Anyway, that's why I saved first. This won't be a problem, you know, as this actually continues to be developed, but I do need to establish the onion skins again. Where's my script editor? Thank you. No, where's all of my extra stuff? Yeah. I seem to have screwed up my my Maya layout here by closing something I should not have closed. Here, let me just undock this and switch to my F-animation workspace. Ah. That's better. Yeah, and now it did exactly what I hoped it wasn't going to do, and closed the ephemeral window. The ephemeral window does not, in this version, properly uninit when you close it. This is what happens when you use pre-alpha software, and I'm going to restart Maya.
Couldn't you just uninit it from the script editor?
Actually, yes, I could have done that. That would have solved the issue, and I didn't actually need to restart Maya. But I did anyway. I promise you, like, an actual release version would not have any of these issues. Yeah, it's in the F-animation mode. Yeah, there we go. Everything's back. Like, half the things we do when you're programming is, you know, actually solving whatever problem you're trying to solve, and the other half, like, the other 90% is just, like, finding all of the places where things are randomly broken in a dumb way and fixing them. Especially when you're interfacing with Maya, like a system like Maya, a host system as it were, where you've got all of this stuff that works by its own rules that aren't necessarily very obvious to you. And you've got to like figure out how things interact with Maya's undo cube and how things interact with Maya's you know, just like the general way in which Maya handles you know, Windows and its you know, its sort of like weird relationship with Qt and all of this other stuff that you got to figure out. It's not fun.
Yeah. Yeah, but I mean, it tends to shake itself out.
It
There's
does.
just, this one's a pretty simple one. It's just one we haven't gotten around to fixing.
Yeah, yeah, it is. It's just like there's a long list of those things, and it's not fun to fix them. So I'm always like, sort of tempted to just go, go solve whatever problem I think is actually cool right now, and not solve like these dumb issues. We really have to get to it. But anyway, what I did just show is basically why currently, before I implement selfish nodes, which may be one of the next things to implement actually, you can't just bias this back towards where it is in relationship to the cube. Because instead, what you just saw before I realized I had to restart Maya, is that instead the cube, instead of having the hand move relative to the cube move relative to the hand. Because currently, the node that is active, whatever you are currently have selected and you're currently moving around, that's the one that's going to drive other things, which is often the right thing to do, but not always. Sometimes you'd want other things that control it to take precedence for exactly this kind of situation. And that's why I want to implement this switch for like selfish nodes. And all that would do is to change like, do I start tracing the graph from the thing I have selected, or do I start tracing it from the things that the thing I have selected is controlled by? And that will, just give you the option of doing it either way, and it probably should solve the issue and also undo. I mean, I've already solved that undo problem. We just couldn't use the most recent version. So here's what I'm going to do. So I turned off glue active, which means that if I bias, I'm going to do the fingers too. If I bias the hand, I'm just gonna eyeball it for the moment, which is not ideal, but like for the moment it's whatever, and kind of do it like that. Let's see. Yeah, I mean, for this purpose, eyeballing it is fine. And here I'm gonna bias it a bit towards where it's gonna be, but not all the way. And like that's as he's grabbing on. So then I want to extend this out a little bit more. I just want it to be like, and I'm going to add a pose here in a second to sort of do this he's grabbing onto it thing. But I just want it to be very clear that you see that catch, right? And that means I think that his hand really ought to be like more like this, so that it can sort of come up here, and then we're going to add another pose for it to actually grab on. All right, let's see how this is looking. Yeah, I think that's better. Like, I think you can see a little bit more the way that he's like, bringing his hand up to grab, and then he grabs. So in that case, what I actually do want to do is to take these fingers and bias them over to the next pose, because he will have actually kind of grabbed on by that point. And I'm going to do another one in here, and I am going to use glue active on this one, and I am going to use it on everything, and I am going to do it in default mode. But he shouldn't be, like, should he be like that? Yeah, I think this is kind of him. So we're going to take this and bias it back towards where it previously was, and think about the arc of that a little bit. Now, forgot to turn off glue groups. Because we want to see the catch very clearly there, I think. So we got to have like enough of an anticipation to really notice it. Okay. I think we're starting to get somewhere with that. I think we want the actual catch to happen very, very quickly. And I think that he's got a little too much hang time now over in this region. Much as I like having that sort of like, something happens slow, fast. Like, I like that timing, but sometimes it feels like it doesn't work, right? I mean, I wish I had actually a better explanation for why I don't like it as much here, but it just feels like there's something unnatural about how much he was hanging there, and sometimes how much you should do it is just like a judgment call. Yeah, that feels a little better to me. Right. All right. Let's do the actual grab now. So he's getting it over to here. Glue active on this one. Gonna do a breakdown. But I am going to turn off glue active and push his hand a little bit more so that maybe actually push it a little bit more out here for that exaggeration. Feels a little floaty now. That catch, like the whole thing feels a little floaty. I think this all has to be faster. This happens a lot, actually, where you're like, I did this thing on 2s, but maybe it should be on 1s. Maybe I should just push all of those closer together. Ah, that is much better. And now I actually feel like I can extend these out a bit more. I think part of the problem with that actually was that because the movement itself didn't have enough contrast, it felt... So this is one of those, like, animation physics doesn't resemble real physics things, right? It's like, in reality, you know, physics has to, like the state that you're in has to follow logically from the state you were previously in. In animation, though, it's all about perception, and therefore, when you push the contrast on something, that often means that you can get away with stuff that feels unnatural otherwise, because it feels animated, you know, like, for lack of a better term. So let's put a little more time into this. Let's see how that feels. I think that's not too bad. Ah, I think I see what this is missing. Right, so he's got it over here, but I think his arm, well, the other one, has to be even more out at this point. So that you can see it come around and grab on. Let's see if that is the issue that is just making it feel like it just isn't interesting enough to me. Yeah, see how you can actually, like, really see the grab now? Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's completely doing the right thing here. This actually feels a little weird to me, so I'm going to do something slightly different with it. I'm going to have his hand, like, down at the bottom of it at this point. How did it get over there? Doesn't matter. It was behind him when it was moving. Physics doesn't have to make any sense. We're not putting this through any sim. We can pop stuff around however much we want. Which means that we can kind of do it over here, as the momentum of the cube carries it up faster than his hand is actually moving. And then, let's do it a little more like that. Now, to make this really work, you got to bring this even further down, I think. Which also sort of fits the idea of how he might grip on at this point. How did his hand get down there? Doesn't really matter. I mean, if we really want to, like, try to make it make a little more sense, we can start having it be down here a little bit at this point. Maybe make sure this is bent in a more reasonable fashion. I am flying around with these controls and grabbing them because I'm using the pick walker. All right. That's feeling a lot better to me. Now, so there's a number. So what's the next question to ask? Right. So let's just look at the whole thing as a whole now. Again, ignoring the beginning, which I may just not bother to do because it's actually not that important to the demonstration of how you'd animate. I think you can see how I would have gone and animated that beginning. All right. So there's two places. Thing number one, the way he settles in right here, pretty stiff. You can look at the way his head just comes right into it. You know, we need to polish that a bit. And it's an interesting note here about what polish sort of means in the context of interpolationless animation. Because normally we think of polish as like, well, you kind of get your stuff together. You get your poses together and you eventually spline them, and then polish is like trying to get rid of all the little problems. I sort of feel like polish shouldn't really be some special stage. It should be more like polish is trying to like if you think about it, like this, a classic way of thinking about pose to pose animation with splining, right? And a lot of people don't do this anyway, but it is a classic way to think about it. Is you would do something like this, and then you'd solve this problem of it being stiff in the polish step. Like, that's one way to think about it. Now, of course, lots of people don't do that because it's super hard, and they will actually like put that right in the poses. In which case, what they're really doing, in a sense, is pulling some of what we think of as polish sort of into the posing stage. And because there's no longer a stage change here, right? You never go from blocking to polish. You just sort of keep blocking until you are now polishing. It's a gradient instead of a switch. There's a lot of stuff that sort of we're doing even at this stage where clearly, the poses are, like not in between in a lot of cases, that essentially amounts to polish. And I do really like the fact that we can bring that consideration of feel into the shot at any stage. All right, so he picks it up. I think the pickup's probably the next question to ask. Because this one's less important, because even though it's obviously a question, like what should this do, because this isn't good, it's also something with a fairly straightforward answer, I think. And so this question here, especially this grab, I like these grabs, right? I like the feeling of physicality of having the character clearly changing his grip on this thing. And this one is also getting kind of lost in the motion. So let's just kind of like zoom in on that a little bit and think about how he's picking the thing up. Yeah, let's look at this. So he grabs on, he pulls, he's bringing his hand back there, and he's already... See, it's a bit tricky, because you want it to read closely. Like, you want it to read... Sorry, closely, what am I saying? You want it to read clearly. Ah, I see what the problem is. I just need to add a little bit more in here, because here's the thing. As he starts to bring this thing over on its edge, that's exactly when he should be. Like, he pulls on it a little bit, but midway through, his hand starts to come away. And right now, the problem is we're not actually seeing that happening until right here. So, the obvious answer to this is let's start, doing some more breakdowns in here, and then we can answer that question. Let's see. What mode are we in? We're in default. That's probably the right thing. So, at some point in here, like, here's where I want to bring his arm back. And here's another thing about leading with the elbow. So, having his hand come out a little bit this way while having the elbow... See, this is kind of an interesting thing. It's like a whip motion, right? The elbow starts to come in before he starts grabbing. And that just, like, adds this flexibility to the motion. It's very cartoony, right? There's lots of cases where you probably wouldn't want to do that. I'm going to modify this a little bit, too. But I like stuff like that. I feel like it adds, like, a real nice, feel, like, that whip-like motion. Filippo Machi says, the breakdown slider works exactly like the tween machine. Well, more or less, in the sense that you have, you're creating a breakdown. I mean, certainly the breakdown concept is basically the same. The main differences are, A, it's interactive, and that's very nice. The tween machine is not. And B, all of the interpolation that it's doing is ephemeral, meaning it'll act differently depending on the mode you're in and what you have selected and your context. And so that gives you a much better sense of, this is, a lot more control over how the breakdown gets created. In a way that, and I've belabored this point, but it's worth saying again because it's important, right? In a way that has no implications for other breakdowns you make, right?
I would say they work very, very differently. Right?
Well, they work very, very differently internally, right?
But also in terms of what they do, the fact that this breakdown is aware of the ephemeral mode and aware of the ephemeral connections is a really different thing. I mean, having written a regular breakdown tool that's pretty similar to the tween machine, the Ansvin breakdown thing, like, that's basically just sort of looking at some things in space and interpolating between them. You can have, some options for how you do that. But with the ephemeral system, there's a great deal of sort of instantaneous context that determines
Yup.
how it actually works.
Yeah, that's really the important part about it. What I kind of meant by that is like the tween, like if you know what a breakdown is, this will make a breakdown. Like that concept will make sense to you, right? So in that sense, you could say, yeah, it's a breakdown slider, but it does definitely work very differently than the tween machine, or than the Ansevin, breakdown tool. Although at least in that case, it was interactive, and that is something I think is very nice. All right, let me just actually check and see if the cube did the right thing. Yeah, it did. All right, so. All right, so as we're thinking about this, I'm like, all right, before I go and make another one, I want to put a little bit of thought into what some of the other aspects are doing here, like the head. Yeah, I actually want to change the head over here. Actually, here's a great way to do this. Like, speaking of sliders, I am going to switch to free mode. So now the head is not being controlled by anything. And I am going to smooth it. And what that is going to do is purely in world space. Right. So that's, sorry, I actually don't want to smooth. I want to re-break it down. Purely in world space, like here's where it's going to. Here's where it came from. It's ignoring everything else because it's in free mode. I just want it to be like at a reasonable position in between those two things.
Raph, I almost think, going back to what we were saying before, it might be worth kind of showing this about sort of breakdown and re-breakdown, like what happens as you switch modes, for instance.
Just so yeah, you know what? Clear. Actually, yeah, let's make that really clear. So like let's say I'm making I'm just find like one with like a big pose change, or maybe I'll just make like a pose for whatever. Like let me just switch to all mode. That's Control C, and it's like, oh, he's like that, right? Oh, I had blue active off. What doesn't matter. Like this is like a whatever, right? So here's something. So if I were to make, I'm using blends affect everything, and I'm going to be in default mode. And if I'm in default mode, everything that is sort of like world space by default, which includes things like hands and the torso and the pelvis and like a bunch of other elements, they're going to move in a straight line. So as you can imagine, that's going to make him shrink, right? And if I was like spinning him around at the same time, like let's say I went over here and was like also like, he's in this completely different pose, then what I would end up with is something where he'd go through himself. Oh, because I'm still in all mode, which basically does the same thing as forward. In this case, he didn't. But let me go back to default so I can show you what I mean. Yeah, so it's like, I mean, he doesn't really go through himself in this particular case, but you can see his limbs all shrinking. It's all straight lines, and also at one point they flip because it's all straight lines. All right, let me do that. Like, let's say that's the pose. I'm going to now switch to forward, and I'm going to re-break it down. Exact same thing. Note that none of that happens because now the whole body's acting like it's FK. And the important point is, you're making that choice just for one breakdown, and it's not even necessarily just for that breakdown. Like, I could then take just this foot and turn off blends use all nodes and re-break it down just that foot in default and get a different result. So now that foot is moving in a straight line, but everything else is moving in an arc that's been, an FK, standard FK sort of arc. So, and then I go make another breakdown. I can choose to do it in a totally different way. And what this makes it so nice, because when you have, one of the things I find so frustrating with conventional rigs is you've got a case where a character's like handling something or they're making some gesture. And this is clearly like an IK sort of thing to do, right? You're like, I just want to control where my hand is. And then you have a character doing backflips or something. Well, unless you want to manage FK-IK switching and a bunch of other similar stuff, which is an enormous pain and which is, just like requires endless trouble, then you basically are kind of stuck. Like, you want to do that big motion, you're going to end up having to like plot out that hand movement purely in IK. The rig won't help you anymore. If you want the rig to help you, you have to switch modes, which implies a whole bunch of stuff about how it interpolates and how you're going to like ease from IK into FK or switch from IK into FK or any of the other stuff that you're going to do. And in this case, none of that matters at all. You just decide what you want to do for the making of a particular breakdown or a particular series of in-betweens. And any alteration you make to it, like, say, smoothing things, for instance, anything we do to, like, fix any issues, could perfectly well be happening in a different rig mode. So I could use FK to spin my, I mean, like, here, let's just do that. So let's do some in-betweens. I'm going to go to forward mode, so I'm in FK. I'm going to tell it to use everything. And I'm going to do it, I'm going to do an in-between. Actually, here's what I'm going to do. So I am going to, I'm just thinking about, like, what would make a really good case for this. Yeah, here's what I'm going to do. I'm actually going to do 2 different poses. So here's a different one. I'm going to do something like that, right? Oh, whoops, I'm an idiot. I edited the pose instead of making a new one. It still happens to me occasionally, even though I'm the one who decided it should work that way. All right, anyway, I'm gonna make some in-betweens. I'm gonna be per frame 2. I'm gonna be in forward mode. I mean, alt mode kind of does the same thing in the case of using in-betweens, but anyway. And I'm gonna do the same thing over here. Right. So here's this case. Now note of course, the hitch, right? The sudden momentum change. That sudden momentum change is exactly the kind of thing you don't want to see. But if now you could smooth this in forward mode just as we're doing, but note kind of what's happening to the hand over there. So let's say we do smooth it in forward mode. Let's see what ends up happening. I'm going to do smooth over time with 2 iterations. Okay, so you can see that the body movement is getting smoothed, but is the hand movement and like it works okay for this hand, right? But like, see how this hand is still kind of like, it kind of hits a wall, right? Look at this hand here, because it's being driven by the body, because forward is FK. So here's what I can do. I can take that hand, I can switch myself into default mode, I can check off blends use all nodes, so I'm only affecting that hand and not anything else, and I can smooth these poses using that method, just affecting the hand. And note that the hand now eases into that motion very nicely, right? Specifically because I created those in-betweens in FK, but I fixed the issue with them in world space, right? Like the hands in world space in default mode. And that kind of thing makes things so easy, you know? And it's so painful with conventional rigging and conventional interpolation.
And this is really kind of at the heart of how the ephemeral system works. And this isn't just like these particular tools. This is true of pretty much all of the blend tools, right?
Right. I mean, they all work that way. Yeah.
All these tools, they're aware of what mode you're in, and you can selectively apply them to certain nodes.
So it's like there is something comprehensive about this way of animation that conventional rigging doesn't really have. Like conventional rigging tends to be like everything's a special case. And therefore, if you want to be able to, say, space switch the hand into some other space and do something with it, like, I mean, you potentially could. I mean, there are other ways to look at that. You could bake it into another space, right? That baking it into another space is sort of the way, for instance, that Richard Leaco's space switching system handles the same problem. Sure. It's basically the same issue. It's just handled in a very different way and in a way that is much less instantaneous.
Right. Well, what it really is that you have to commit.
Right.
With a rig. You have to commit to that rig working in a certain way, and it always works that way. And if you want it to be able to work in 2 ways, now you have to do a whole bunch of magic so it can work in this way and this way, but you're still committing to those 2 ways, right? You don't have all of the tools, all of the ways of manipulating things. Like, that's the thing about the ephemeral system. You're not committing to any way. You can just choose at any time.
Right, exactly. And there's the little bit of commitment that you do. I mean, you sort of configure it a little bit when you make the rig to be saying, like, well, okay, you know, this is a leg and this is an arm, and you know, like here's what the different pieces of each, you know, can do. But it's a much higher level, much like looser description of what's you're not describing how things work. You're describing how they can work. If you see
even that in theory could be quite switchable, though.
Yeah. Oh, I mean, it absolutely
we haven't done it because it's not really your use case, but you know, even that could be switched in and out. There just isn't a lot of commitment to the technique in terms of making decisions up front.
Well, and that's the other nice thing about it too, which is when you're not. And so here's a classic problem that people just have constantly, right? It's you discover some issue with your rig that has implications for how it is interpolating or how it's used. You really want to fix that rig, but you can't because you've animated an enormous amount of stuff with it already. Now, I mean, you could have like two versions of it, and that's actually quite common. Like a lot of pipelines will have things like, oh, you have like, you've got version 1 and you've got version 2, and some shots can be referencing version 1 and some shots can be referencing version 2. But I mean, that gets pretty ugly. Like sometimes that kind of thing is necessary, but what would be really nice is if you simply could say like, well, I'm going to change how this rig behaves, but it has no implication for what stuff is already doing, because it only ever calculates when you're actually manipulating stuff anyway.
Right. You have to do extra work to get the alternatives. And I mean, in theory, not in practice, but in theory, you could build a Maya rig that essentially had all of the different options that the Ephemeral did and ways of turning them on and off. It could, in theory, be done with the scene graph. In practice, it would be completely impractical.
Oh my God. Right? Like, yeah, exactly. Like attempting to actually do that would be like, yeah, that's not going to happen.
So that's really the issue, is you have to commit to one thing, and if you want two things, you have to kind of say, okay, I want both of these things, but I have to do a lot of work to make those two things happen. And then as you get more and more things that you want, the work you have to do to make them happen is multiplicative, essentially, with the number of things you want to happen.
And that's a big part of what the ballooning complexity. I mean, we talked a little bit before about why Contour is, despite being a more expensive algorithm than having some joints and linear blend weighting, is still often actually produces faster rigs. Even though Contour itself is not on the GPU, it's often produces faster rigs not because the deformation method is faster in theory, but because you don't an enormous number of the ballooning complexity. Like that's another aspect of the problem of ballooning, the multiplicative, that perhaps in some cases exponential complexity of rigs. Like it's kind of crazy given how incredibly fast computers are. GPU or no GPU, computers are super fast, right? And GPUs are insanely fast, assuming you have a highly parallelizable case, right? But given how fast computers are, it's crazy how slow rigs are. And some of that comes down to like the way that the Maya node graph functions in some cases. I mean, parallel eval made it a lot better, but it's still inefficient in some respects. And a lot of that just comes down to stuffing so much stuff in your rig. I mean, we were talking again before about how probably it isn't even worth trying to parallelize the ephemeral system. If you wrote it in a performant language, it would be so fast it wouldn't matter. And the reason for that is not that what it's doing is not that the system itself is necessarily hyper efficient, but that it doesn't have to do very much. Right? A Maya rig needs to have an enormous amount of behavior being calculated at all times through the node graph, paying the node tax, as we say. Like the ephemeral system just figures out what its graph ought to be, and then the actual math it has to do is pretty minimal, really. Like it's a bunch of matrix operations. Those are not slow. I mean, it could get faster if we wanted to rewrite it even more performantly. I mean, we're using NumPy for it. It's not like it's not super slow. But
that's purely a matter of convenience. It doesn't really matter what you do to multiply the matrices. It just, we happen to have NumPy at hand.
Right.
We're going to rip that out actually, because we don't want to try to bake NumPy into like a distributable.
I mean, that's a fair point actually, which is even if we wrote all the math operations in pure Python, it would probably still be pretty fast, because you just don't have to do very much of them, right? The amount of math you have to do for this rig is so minimal that if we eventually rewrote it in a more performant language, it would be...
you know what the cost would be, actually? It would be garbage collecting the matrices. It wouldn't be the math.
Right, exactly. Like, if we in Python, right, that would be where you'd actually get any slowdown. It wouldn't even be the math itself at all. Anyway, just looking at... There are some comments. Filippo Machi says, is it possible to learn this power? Well, in terms of writing a system yourself... I mean, I think it would be difficult. I mean, we spent a lot of time on this. It was difficult. But in terms of having it available so that you could use it, I mean, that is absolutely what we're aiming for, right? It's not releasable yet. And, I mean, on this very stream, you've seen some of the reasons why it's not releasable yet. It is definitely not a finished system. But it is. But also,
it probably could use a UI. I would say a UI.
Oh, yes. It needs more. It needs more. I mean, it has a UI, but only for the animation side of it. And even that needs a lot of stuff. Like the Blue Group stuff, for instance, needs more UI. Like, I mean, we're going to be adding some additional features. We need to figure out where they're going to go. One of the things I actually want to do, I actually do want to do an overhaul of this UI as well, because I feel like we're going to end up with too much stuff to, like, stuff it into some tabs like we have here, and that it would be nicer to have something a bit more similar to, like, Maya's, you know, like what they do with the attribute editor. You know, not that I mean, in general speaking, I actually don't really like the Maya attribute editor, but this thing is really nice, where you just have like a bunch of twirl downs, and you can just like twirl them up and twirl them down, and like you can have a lot of entries in there, and like you just twirl away the ones you don't want, and like I think we're probably going to end up with something more like that eventually for this. So there's work to be done is the point, but it is getting there. Anyway, where were we? Where were we when we started talking about this? Yeah, I was thinking about that, and of course now you can see what's going on there much more nicely in terms of like how this hand behaves. So let's take another look at that. Yeah. So here's what I like about that, right? It's this. There's a tendency when we're talking about pose to pose where we're being very strictly pose to pose, and we want to keep poses like rigid, right? There's this idea of like when you set up your key poses and that defines your shot, and I don't like that, right? I want to be able to have things like this where it's like in the middle of this motion there's this other little counter motion that makes it feel tactile. It makes it feel like he's touching something, that he like adjusts his grip and like moves his hand around. And even though it's like a super exaggerated cartoony version of that, like if you were an actual person, you would not, you know, do it in quite this way, because, you know, that whole motion is like a super cartoony, like wiggly motion. But it still gives that sense that your character is in a place and can be affected by and touch things. You know, I just saw the Sea Beast, you know, which is this Netflix movie that was just released. And I thought they did an excellent job with the tactility of motion in that, actually, in terms of it's not nearly as cartoony as what I'm doing here. But, you know, it's certainly not realistic either. And the style that they're going for there really nicely gives the sense of like they're on this ship, they're fighting this monster right there, and the tactility of having them like put their hands against things right as they move, because the ship's bucking around, and like grab things and like have them slip through their hands a little bit as they're moving, or like have a little misstep, like that gives you so much more of a sense of this is a person. Even if it's like a very stylized, even if it's like an animated person, right? This is a person who is alive, and who affects the world, and the world affects them. And that's something that I think, you know, it's easy to lose track of that stuff in animation. Not that this is like the best example of that you could possibly get either, right? You know, like, but it is something I care about a lot. Yeah. See, I feel like, doesn't it make it feel like he's really lifting the thing? That he, like, does that? Now, of course, the next bit is going to be, what does it feel like when he actually grabs it? Because we're missing a pose there that would elucidate how that motion there feels. And that may actually be a bit too fast. Like, I'm pushing the contrast there a lot. But maybe it's not. Let's see. Yeah, you know, it is, but not... Here's what we need to do. We need to do another breakdown here that pushes it almost there. So I'm switching to default mode. Turning glue active back on, I'm using blends all nodes, and I'm going to make a breakdown that moves most of the way there. Because he should have this very fast motion in order to sell sort of his motion there. I'll actually do that a little bit more. He should have that very fast motion because of the contrast that you want, the slow fast. But it's very helpful to be like, all right, he hits this and keeps going a little. And there are actually tools in the Ephemeral system that can help with that. Like, another way to do that would be overshoot, and there is an overshoot slider. But in this case, I kind of wanted to hit this pose, but I wanted to kind of not be quite there yet. And let's see, like that. Yeah, that's better. You know, again, you think about everything all the time, which means I am thinking about his ear, I mean, whatever the hell those things are. I don't even know if they're ears, antenna, whatever. And how they are going to react here. And I'm going to say that by the time they get over here, actually, they should be a lot more up. And then as they come back down again, as he's about to make that motion, like, they can move their shape a little bit. Yeah, there we go. And so what this produces is, look, so here's an aspect of like looking at things with onion skins that I feel is just really, really important. Although actually this suggests that this isn't quite what it should be. It should be more like that. because, which you can see from the onion skins. Here's something I think is really important in animation. Look at his ears and the top of his head, and then at the top of the head over here. Look at the negative space formed by those four poses. There's an arc that's basically made out of the negative space of those poses that's interesting. And if you look at, I mean, here's one example where they just do this amazingly well. If you've ever looked at, I spent a bunch of time at one point framing through the Disney Tarzan, and like, that's I think like Glenn Keane at the height of his powers, and looking, and like so much of that motion has this negative space to the trail that you can see his body making through space, and that kind of thing. It's like, how do you judge that with a graph editor? You can't. You can't even judge it with like, like motion trends. You can only judge this by actually seeing how the poses flow together. And in fact, I'm going to say that this suggests that I should push his head down just a little bit, even at this point, because that makes it, I think, a little bit of a nicer thing. And then at this point, the ears start coming up, and, he sort of goes out of that motion. But that's the kind of thing that I think is just really, like, it's really nice. It really helps sell the graphical aspects, the interesting aspects of animation, like, really nicely. All right, let's take a look at this. There we go. I feel like that's getting somewhere. Filippo Bacci says Tarzan is always great animation material to study. It really is. Like it is. It is a masterpiece of I won't say that the movie necessarily is. It's kind of but the animation in that film is it's astonishing.
Yeah, I mean, it's clearly been pretty influential for you, Raph. I think about actually the animation that we have at the top of the Notional Pipe page, right?
Yep.
Which is
Yep.
a monkey sort of swinging and sliding down the bole of a tree, right? And that seems, I mean, no offense, but almost directly lifted from Tarzan.
Yeah, I mean, it's not directly lifted in the sense of, like, actually matching anything particularly, but the style, 100%, like, yep, I was totally looking at Tarzan about that.
Yep.
And that's, like, it has absolutely been hugely influential on me. So I feel like this is, again, like, every step we take, we start to fill things out and just make it a little more clear how this is going to feel. Like, we're getting, like, really pretty close now. So let's go ahead a little further. What's the next thing? Right, I was going to say, like, if we look at this whole motion, there's definitely bits that are undefined, like his in-betweens on that step in, and, like, some of what he's doing during some of his held poses here, but they're not that undefined, right? You can sort of look at that, and you pretty much know what they'd end up having to be. So, so here's a bit that's genuinely a little bit undefined, which is, what does this head do, right? When he's coming back, he's caught the thing, and he's, and like, what's, like this is just really stiff, like this motion in here. So I think that's the next question to answer is, what should that be? So he catches it, and I think the catch is fine. Like, I mean, arguably he could bring it down more to sort of sell the weight of the thing, but he's really got his center of gravity, like, right under it now. So I think it's okay for the thing to just sort of, like, bounce a little bit as he catches it, instead of like, I don't know though. Let's just actually think about that a bit, because he hits this, and then he comes back up. Yeah, you know what? Let's see about that first, I think. I'm going to give that a little more. I'm going to do this bit on threes, and I'll probably insert a few more in there, or whatever. But let's say that I do a breakdown in here. And what I'm going to do for that whole breakdown, I'm going to go into forward all mode. So I just drag his whole body down a little bit. And just make sure that there's yeah, and I need to like smooth out that hip movement there. So switch it to default, turn off blends default modes, smooth that out a little bit. Yeah, see now it's really counter moving there. If it is the right thing, I'm gonna do something different with the hips to have him sort of accept the weight of it more as it comes against his body. Like this whole pose really needs to get smooth if that's the direction that I want to go with it. Yeah, I think it is actually. And in that case, I need to just take this whole thing and just sort of like smooth it in with the nearby poses a lot more. because otherwise you kind of get a weird result. And this is especially true. Yeah, I'm actually gonna smooth out the whole body motion a little bit here, turning off blends use all nodes because I really only want to affect the pelvis, and doing a smooth over time. Because otherwise there was just this aspect of it was like fighting the motion a little bit, because it's okay for it to sort of start coming up here, but before it was just like it was starting to trend upward here as he was accepting the weight, and sort of it was a counter to what the rest of the motion was at that point. But again, super easy to fix. Now I feel like this is too floaty though, because he's catching it, and that makes sense. Like he's got to do that to catch it, but then as he comes up, I feel like that's got to be a little faster, and I'm actually going to extend this out so I can add another pose in here. Now, does that actually need to be on ones? Maybe. Because we want to make sure that the contrast, right? We want to make sure there's some contrast. Does that look good if it's on ones? Maybe. Yeah, that looks better. Right? It's the contrast, and in that case, I'm actually going to extend this out a little bit more. Add another one in the middle here. And just probably drop him just slightly in there. Let's see. Yeah, that's a little better. I think that feels a little more like there's actual weight on him, you know? Like it comes down and then he shoots up more quickly though. And that helps like make the motion look more interesting, like have more contrast. So there's something a little missing in it. Let me see what happens if I make this bit here. Like if I make this actually a little faster, and make this bit a little slower. Let's make sure we don't see the onion skins when we're doing that. Does that look better? I think it does, actually. I think it helps feel a little nicer to have again, you know, increases the contrast of the motion. Alright, so now, like, he's coming up with it, and what is it about this motion that I want to do? Because, you know, it definitely looks like, it just looks, like, very, like, simple, right? You know, it's very CG right now. It's very direct. I actually think that the motion of his body is more or less okay there. Although it needs like more of a slow down, slow out at the end. It's really the motion of his head that doesn't work, right? And so here, you know, we can do two things. One is we can look at and I think in this case I just will. Although, again, one useful thing I could do is I could put this in free mode and bias it back towards where it's going to be in world space. And, you know, I don't know if I would have particularly done that in this case. I sort of did it more as a demonstration. I don't know if this particular thing really... Yeah, see, I want to do that in IK mode so that the head will maintain its position, but everything else will move around as one would expect. Okay, so the IK mode is really sort of a misnomer. One of the things that becomes a little difficult when you're trying to construct a system that works very differently than what people are used to is you end up trying to use some existing nomenclature, but you don't really quite mean what that nomenclature actually means. And you just want to, like, give people some idea of what you're talking about. It becomes a little tricky. Alright. This should happen a little faster, I think. Yeah, maybe like over this. There we go. And then we need to come up and around into that pose, I think. So, let's see. Break down. Nope. I wanted that to be forward all, so it would move his whole upper body. Because, so that's the thing about poses, right? Or that's the thing about arcs, I should say. Which is part of the problem that we had before. Is anytime, like, so here's... Sorry, I couldn't stop ranting. Like, I did. I'm gonna keep doing it. It's just it's part of this stream apparently. So the one of the things that drives me crazy, or drove me crazy, I should say, back when this was a thing, and it's not really a thing as much anymore, but like in the earlier days of CG, when people really felt like FK was going to get them arcs for free. And of course, FK does get you arcs in the sense that your hand doesn't literally travel in a straight line, like it does actually, do some sort of arc. But that's not really what arcs mean in animation, really, right? Because if you were keyframing something in FK, right, you've got the arm over here, you've got it over here, and you've got it back over there, right? Yes, it will be not a straight line, but it's really not. I mean, like, does that even count as an arc? Right? It's not a very good one, anyway, right? And there's a very great tendency in CG because of the fact that we are using, and even in the ephemeral system, when you make a breakdown, you're using interpolation. It's just not persistent interpolation. Interpolation tends to move in straight lines in one sense or another. Even a slurp, right? Even something where it's rotation that you're interpolating and you're doing it in like the best way that we have, which is a quaternion slurp. In a sense, it's a straight line. It's just a straight line on a sphere, right? It's the shortest path along a sphere. So if you have two things, you're going to go there, and then you're going to come exactly the same way back. And that is awful. Like, that just looks terrible in animation. So it's always on us to think about what do those arcs mean in screen space and to prevent things from going straight where they're going to go. You usually want them to go a little bit to the side and then around or something, or like a little bit too far, but you don't want it to be too far and then straight back. You want it to be like a little bit to the side and too far. I sort of call that a hook arc, And so here, what we're creating here is actually a little hook arc on that cube, right? So like it comes down, but instead of going straight where it's going, it's like slightly off center and then back. And so then for the head, let's do one more pose in here. Have it overshoot slightly. And then come back. And one of the things that I really like is when you can do stuff like this, and I know, again, like I'm thinking about, like, think about this as the shape being described by the head, the flow of poses, the thing that you can't see with a graph editor, or even with, curved sequence, you could only see it through onion skinning. Or by, like, flipping between poses really rapidly, which is essentially using the after image in your brain as onion skinning, which is ridiculous. But, like, that's actually how we animate a lot of the time, right? We're just like, oh, we flip back and forth between the poses. You're doing onion skinning. You're just doing it in your brain, which is not an efficient way to do it. Actually, like, the shoot forward of his head there is actually not working at all there. Similarly, I'm going to switch to free mode, and I'm going to smooth that out. And make it a little higher for arc purposes. Now I'm thinking that is a little bit much, but you still want to be a little off-center in terms of how it gets brought down there. Getting there, but not really quite there. There's like a bit of an awkward, like, thing there in the head where it's like it comes up and the head, that's a wall hit, right? I could just smooth that out, and maybe I will. But I was thinking about what the best way to deal with that. Maybe that is the right thing to do. Switching to free mode again, I'm going to smooth this bit. I'm going to do a smooth over time. Want to make sure it's not affecting anything but the head. I'm doing it in world space because that's pretty important. One moment. Caitlin, I'm doing a stream. Caitlin, I am sorry. I have a 12-year-old daughter. Anyway, like between cats and kids, you always have to keep them out of the office. Winter streaming, anyway. All right, that's working better. Although not quite right yet. There's something a little bit too much about that like head like you know. And I am actually going to, and like in a lot of cases I wouldn't do this because I'd be like, oh, you still want to like control the arc a little bit better. But honestly, like smoothing works well in this case, right? In terms of figuring out how, like taking something that's a little bit too strong and softening it. It's very equivalent to the sort of thing that you do in ZBrush, right? I see ZBrush sculptors do this. I'm not much of a ZBrush sculptor myself, but you're like, I'm gonna fill in sort of like these general shapes that I want, but they've got a little like some weirdnesses to them, and I'm gonna take my smooth brush and I'm gonna get rid of the weirdnesses, right? And this is basically an equivalent sort of idea. In free mode, don't want to affect anything but the head, and I want it to be in world space. That's much better, right? Filippo Machi says, I heard lots of 2D animators saying that using onion skins forces you to think about moving lines and not moving forms. I think that's a good way of putting it, yeah. Like, if you think about moving forms as being, like, the actual dimensionality of your object, which has its own useful qualities, but it's not necessarily the thing that makes animation look good. Because what you see is not the actual shape. What you see is its shape in screen space. And the equivalent of a 2D animator saying, like, thinking of moving lines is in a sense like moving edges or something, right? It's like what's the actual screen space shape of this thing, and how do those screen space shapes flow together? And that's the sort of thing that like CG just makes that so painful to figure that stuff out normally, and it's really easy when you do it this way. Let's see, breakdown. It should be everything. So we just want to like get real close there and have a final slow out. Probably a blink. Probably you're going to put a blink in there too. I'm going to get to that at some point. All right, let's take a look at this. I mean, you can definitely see how this is better. I'm still not quite happy with it. And I think the problem is really this right there. You've got that like, because you do kind of want his head to pop up a little bit here. But it's just the suddenness of it, doesn't work with the slowing out motion that we have going on here. Let's just see what happens if I smooth it a little more. Might or might not actually be the right thing to do. Or maybe I'll just do it, I'll just smooth some things more directly. So, no blends, use all modes. I'm going to smooth this in a little bit. Oh, I see what the problem is. I wasn't doing the ears and the bit here when I was smoothing. Which meant that they, like, the dimensions of his head, because this is a squash and stretch control, like, that wasn't being smoothed. And so, like, the head was actually, like, kind of like the top was popping up in a way that wasn't great. So here I'm doing it pose by pose, so I can sort of try to judge it a little bit as I go. It probably wouldn't matter in this case. Like, I'm just going to take these ears and I am gonna smooth them a little bit. That's better. Yeah. I think it's now even a little bit too slow. And also, I am looking at the movement of his shoulders. Like, now we're really getting into polish,
It feels like it takes a long time for the head to come back.
It's there's a
very slow and floaty.
Yeah, there's a number of things about this that I want to change, and one of them is the timing. But one of them is also smoothing those shoulders out, because they were kind of hitting a bit of a wall there, and then I'm going to push the timing in a bunch more. Actually, I'm just going to do this. And then shift this over. Let's see how that looks. That's feeling a little better. Let's just see. Yeah, the head's still popping up a little bit too much. All right, now I'm going to do an additional smooth just on that region, like that region there. But I'm going to use everything, and I'm doing that in again free mode. Do another smooth over time. That's better. Now, he still kind of stops a little bit too much on a dime, I think. But I'm not going to worry about that just yet. Actually, one thing I might do is I might make this a little faster like this, and then add another in between in there. That might be the thing to do. Yeah, that's better. Yeah, I'm feeling the physicality of that a lot better now. Now, see that, I mean, we're really getting into polish now, but actually, mostly that's kind of what we have to do there, you know? Like, we're pretty much at the point where polishing and in-betweening stuff is kind of what we're dealing with. So there's a bit of a wall hit there. But I don't just want to smooth that away, because the thing's super heavy. So if it's moving in this direction, yeah, it shouldn't just come back like that, but maybe it should extend a little further. Actually, this would be a great place to use overshoot. Yeah, I think default will be fine for this, and I want to overshoot this a little bit along the path it was moving. And then I'm going to smooth this back to include that overshoot, and I'm actually going to drop it just slightly. Yeah, that's better. Imagine I was trying to do that with a graph editor. You know, I'd be like scrubbing through and, you know, noodling a million things, and, you know, it's so much easier. All right. Let me just look at this all as one and see what the next thing to do is. Yeah, that's starting to come together pretty nicely, I think. Now, I am going to say this region here is still a little floatier than I want it to be. I may actually take out a couple of these. Let's see. That does look a little nicer, and I'm going to go and actually take out a few poses, because it is actually nice when your eye can lead some of that detail. There we go. Better. It's not a blink. Actually, let's do a little more with these before we add the blink. Here's another thing that bias is quite useful for, and will eventually, you know, become the basis of that new tool, time slip, that I want to do. That's basically the equivalent of bias over time. That looks a little better. All right, now we're really pretty much at the stage here where what we have to do is some more in-betweening. And I'm going to do a little more, and then we're probably going to end for today. I kind of hoped to get this done, but I ended up ranting a bunch, so that didn't happen. But
So unlike you.
yeah, I know. Let's in between some of this stuff. So here's a case, for instance, where, you know, doing some stuff in forward, and then like fixing a bunch of it by in-betweening bits of it is going to be pretty important. You definitely want to use forward for this, right? Because the whole character is like transforming around, and if you tried to do it with, you know, default, you'd get stuff like passing through itself, and it would just have to untangle all of it. It would be a huge pain. But we don't have that problem. So let's do breakdown, and figure out like where do we want to go from here? So, right. So let's say we go back to default and push this up to where it is going to end up, but maybe a little bit like this, because it's just getting into that position. Let's say we do something like this. Because his foot, actually, here's what it should be, because his foot's coming around. It's like it was previously been up there, and you know, we're going to have to, you know, put a 1 in there for sure to elucidate that motion, but maybe it's basically over there at that point. Yeah, that actually I think works reasonably well. Alright, let's look at the arc of this. Unsurprisingly, doing this in FK gave us a weird looking arc for that thing, but that's okay. We're in forward, we're going to be in default, and we're only affecting it. We're going to re in between it, or re-break down it in this case. didn't. Oh, wrong mode. Really would be nice to have those color coded in, but that will not happen until I fix whatever issue that was. Alright, this definitely needs an in-between. I'm going to do that in default because the poses are close enough that I think it's fine to do that and not use forward. Alright. So, this, you can think of the arc like it's over here, so it has to be coming around in an arc like that. His foot, that is. Alright. Yeah, you know, I am going to say that this actually needs, in this pose, to be further along the path that it's going to be going. Now, in this case, one thing I could do is just push it there with bias, but it will be moving in a straight line because we don't want to affect anything but it, and it is not. Well, I mean, no, that's fine. We'll just push it out like this. And actually, now, let's see. Right, so if we want this to sort of fit with the previous pose, we're going to need to invert the direction of that elbow. Ah. Sorry. No. Why are my fingers suddenly forgetting all my keyboard equivalents? That does happen. All my hotkeys, I should say. By calling them keyboard equivalents, I am showing my age here. Oh, I forgot I set that one up improperly. There we go. Thinking about the arc of the thing. Honestly, that's been one of the most difficult things here. Trying to get a nice arc out of this cube. Because it's so big and boxy. You know? Alright, it's getting somewhere. Let's do this next. Again, the shape formed by the cube. It's what I've been struggling with in lots of these poses, actually. Actually, in this pose, I want to push it a little bit back towards where it was previously, which, again, bias makes that super easy. Actually, I maybe want to do that a bunch. In fact, I maybe want to make this whole motion slightly faster. Yeah, let's take a look. Yeah, there we go. Wrong mode. There we go. I really like Pickwalker, actually. At some point I need to put it up so other people can use it. Like many, many things, like, I have been excessively busy, and I would love to do many things that I have not yet done. All right, let's take another look at this. All right, so this is the next bit here, I think. Let's see. Well, so thing number one, this foot is, of course, we did it in default. This foot's moving in a straight line, but I don't think that doing it in forward would even have helped with that. That's just something we gotta manage manually. Maybe even do a little bit like that at this point. And actually, maybe even push this a little bit further out. At this point, it's just like a matter of refinement and I don't know, just going through and making all the bits work nicely instead of like almost work nicely, but not quite. I'm actually thinking I can lead this even a little more now. Yeah. Now let's look at that head motion. Looking at these, like, it just tells you so much. Tells you all the stuff you need to know. All right. Oh. I have to do Shift Z to turn Blue Active back on. It should actually be in default mode. Something still feels a little floaty about this. I may need to make some of this stuff a little faster. Yeah, maybe the turnaround does need to whip a little bit more. All right. See how that sort of works in context. It feels now that's like I kind of stopping on a dime now that it's moving a little faster. So I might want to undo that little bit there and sort of say that the motion in here, that's where it's really fast, is where it's like starts to gain a lot of momentum. Also, I think I can push this even a little further. Whoops. Wrong mode. What if I did like more like that? Actually, I think that does look a little nicer. A little faster in this bit too. Yeah, it's still a little floaty. Might take out one of these. Ah, that's a little nicer. Right, let's sort of look at this in general. Getting there. All right. You know what I actually want to do at this point is I want to pull this one more back towards where it previously was. Pull the cube. Make that pose even a little more exaggerated. Which means that at this point, cube needs to be biased a little bit back towards there. All right. Getting somewhere. Start in betweening. I think I might put a 1 in here because it's such a significant change in motion. I don't know, maybe not though. Sometimes I go like a little too far, and you don't really need all the ones. I do need a 2 in here, though, for sure. This is not quite right. And I think I see why. See how he's like pulling in this direction first, but then it's coming straight up. So I think, maybe that does kind of work, because it does like come up in that direction eventually. Let me add another pose and see how it does. And I'm going to specifically push this foot back more towards there because I want its motion to be more apparent at this point. Actually, I'm going to push this back too. And actually, I'm going to generally push this foot back. This would be time slide if we had a time slide. Looking at the shape of the foot and how it's moving. Maybe even exaggerate that up a little more now that it's happening a little more suddenly. There. Yeah, I mean, it's like super squishy and cartoony in that particular way, but, that's very much the style this is intended to be in, and I feel like the fast and slows work better now. You never know for sure how they're going to work until you actually start adding more in-betweens, which is totally fine, right? Like, you can just, you can, as I have been doing, like, continue to make adjustments to the poses around it as you see ways to improve things. You're sculpting the motion, not, like, laying it out in an unmodifiable fashion. One thing I don't like about this, though, is how he starts this actually, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to bias that backwards in default mode, so it'll be relative to, the things it's relative to, which is to say the foot and the pelvis. Uh-oh. Maya... No, okay. I don't know what Maya was doing, but thankfully it was not a crash. That's another really good example of being able to make these blend operations in the context of, like, whatever context you want, right? In this case, what I'm doing is I'm saying, well, I liked the bend that the leg had on this frame, right? But the position of the foot and the pelvis are obviously different in other frames because I am in default mode, in which case I have pseudo K and like the leg, the knee is relative to the foot and the pelvis. If I go and use any of my blend modes, if I use bias or anything else, what I am going to be doing is biasing towards what that is relative to the things that control it given this particular, configuration or this particular mode of the rig. So I can just say, I want it to be like it was on that other frame, relative to the things that currently control it, and then on another frame, if I do the same thing and I'm in a different mode, I'll have a totally different result. All right. Let's see. Here, actually, we should do this a bit more like here, so we're like really slowing into it. Yeah, that's better. right, let's just add a couple more breakdowns. These ones should be pretty straightforward in that, like, maybe I'll adjust them a little bit to just sort of, like, keep the arc clean. But I'm not really going to do that much because these should be pretty straightforward. And it's pretty okay. Like, this is a 4. In this kind of animation, you can kind of have 4 sometimes. I mean, we can, if it ends up not looking good, we'll change it. But I don't think it necessarily will be a problem. All right, now, here is a new idea. He's picking up this foot here, right? And so what I have right now, and I may return to this in a minute, because I might want to go do some other stuff first. Actually, it's 6 o'clock, so maybe I should cut things off. But see how he's bringing that foot up and he's got this big hang time in the air? So this is kind of an interesting idea. He could do something else with this foot here. He could maybe, like move it around in a little bit of an arc, because he's trying to keep his balance before he ends up bringing it over there. And that's an idea I might want to explore. And it's really okay for me to have that idea, like, way far into doing this, breaking this down, because I haven't made any decisions that lock me into anything in particular, right? So I can go, like, modify those poses, and it's not a problem. I'm not going to do it right now, though. I am, however, I think before I say we are done this time, I am going to just watch through the whole thing. So we are getting pretty close to having, like, a finished piece. Yeah. Certainly stuff still to do, but not that much of it. I mean, we'll be done next time, I'm sure. Okay, so, next time we will have, the actual, we'll have the color coding actually working, and maybe it'll work a little differently. I don't know if I'll have time to rework any of that stuff to maybe work based off of the behavior rather than the constraint. Because I do kind of feel like constraints in the ephemeral system are just not very relevant. They don't matter very much.
I mean, yeah, I don't think they should really be. The user should never have to really.
Right,
even know
exactly. Like right now, right? I had that color coding telling you what constraint it is, but why would the user even care? They really only care about the behavior. So I don't think that's how it should actually work. But we will at least I'll fix that issue, and we'll be able to see it in that state, and I may have a chance to rework it to include behaviors instead. We'll finish this up then, and we'll move on to looking at some other stuff. Maybe we will take a look at one thing we could take a look at, I mean, we've been meaning to do this for a long time, is that there's been this persistent issue of, like, being able to mirror stuff across with transform space blend shapes, which is super useful to be able to do, not just for contour. I mean, it's really nice for contour. It's actually just nice in general. I mean, it's not even just a contour thing. And Maya lacks that feature, and we wanted to talk a little bit more about Python scripting, and that might not be a bad way to do it. Or maybe we'll end up talking a little bit about componentized rigging. I don't know. Okay. We'll have to talk about, like, what a good topic for next time would be.
Yeah, we can talk about that. But yeah, I guess... does anybody have any questions or comments before we go? We should wrap up pretty quickly.
Yeah, we should. But I can certainly answer a couple questions if people have anything to ask.
Okay.
Yeah. I think that the majority of our audience is left actually. You never know really, like, what slice of time people are available for, and sometimes it, like, starts out really low and becomes a lot of people, and then, like, goes back down, and who knows. So So yeah,
okay.
This is the end of our stream, and I hope
thank you, Raph.
Yep, you're welcome.
Thank you all for coming by and asking questions and commenting, and we will see you next time. And thank you, Filippo, for coming by.
Yep, we like having comments. We like having reasons for discussion, even if it makes animation take forever.
I actually think that we should clip the bit. That you were doing there, especially showing how the modes work during like smooths and blends.
I think that's actually a really critical bit. And I'm going to clip that out, and I actually really want to go back. Like, I started doing that, and I did a bunch of them for our first stream, but it's actually kind of a pain. So I haven't gone through and clipped out all of the pieces that ideally we would clip out and make their own little videos out of. But I should do that because it would be an excellent thing to do.
Okay. All right. Great. Well. I guess we will see y'all next week.
Yep. See you guys then, and please like and subscribe, as you know YouTubers are supposed to say.